İyi akşamlar, beni duyuyorsunuz değil mi? İyi akşamlar, schönen Abend. Welcome to our first lecture in the Ringvorlesung. Let's do it in 3 languages at once. So the Ringvorlesung kritische Türkei-Studien is starting today with a lecture by Aslı Vatansever, who I'm very, very happy to introduce, and I'm very pleased that she could make it here. Aslı Vatansever studied first in Turkey at Mimar Sinan Üniversitesi. There she did her bachelor in sociology before she came to Germany, and she did her master's in sociology at the University of Hamburg, where she also stayed and wrote her dissertation titled Ursprünge des Islamismus im Osmanischen Reich, eine weltsystemanalytische Perspektive, and this book was published in 2010. After she completed the thesis at the University of Hamburg, she joined the Division of Humanities and Social Sciences at Doğuş Üniversitesi in Istanbul, and there she started as an assistant professor. In addition to her book and a number of articles on Islamism and secularization in the context of the incorporation of Turkey into the capitalist world economy, Aslı Vatansever's research focuses on the dynamics of the current transition of capitalist societies in general, and on the changing nature of capital-labor relations in particular. In 2015, she co-authored a book titled Ne ders olsa veririz, Akademisyenin vasıfsız işçiye dönüşümü, Ready to Teach Anything, the transformation of the academic into unskilled worker. The book deals with the commodification of the academic labor force. In 2016, Aslı Vatansever was granted the associate professorship title by the Council of Higher Education, YÖK, in Turkey upon successfully passing written and oral exams. Currently, she's a guest researcher at the Zentrum Moderne Orient in Berlin, and there she works on a project titled Partners in Crime, the anti-intellectualist complicity between the state and the universities in Turkey. Please help me welcome Aslı Vatansever. We will have the discussion later in any language that we choose, in Turkish, English, or German. That depends on what kinds of questions come, but the lecture itself will be in English. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Thank you. It's really nice to be here and to have the opportunity to give lecture after a year upon my dismissal from the university in Istanbul. It's kind of a funny feeling, but I will try to get used to it. It's been a year since I gave lecture. And as you may have noticed, I don't have any PowerPoint slides whatsoever. Actually, I know that it's kind of a prerequisite to use fancy visual aids in conferences and seminars these days, but I thought to myself, if I am expected to talk about the precariousness of academic labor, what better visualization could I use than myself? As an academic who worked for almost 6 years at a private university under miserable conditions and then got fired and also banned from public service altogether upon signing a political declaration, and now struggling to survive on temporary scholarships, I stand here today as the embodiment of the politically and economically precarized academic labor force. And as I've been telling everyone for the last couple of months, as a sociologist whose research happens to focus on the precariousness of academic labor and on precarious work relations, I feel like an oncologist who has just diagnosed cancer on herself. And if any of you plan to pursue an academic career, I'm here to tell you, don't. Or at least don't let yourselves get caught off guard like so many before you. Be prepared to fight and survive. You may think that an academic career is a secure and quiet path, but it's actually a battlefield. And in the following, I will try to make you understand why I think of it as a battlefield. But first, we need to clarify some basic terminology, and then we can proceed to the current pressure mechanisms imposed upon the academics in Turkey. So let's start with the basics. First of all, and this you should always keep in mind, we are living in a capitalist world economy. And the main credo of capitalism is the maximization of capital accumulation. How do you accumulate capital? To puzzle that out, Marx turned his gaze to commodity, this mysterious phenomenon where human needs and desires, market mechanisms and production relations, capital and labor intersect. And according to Marx, a commodity is a good or a service that is produced by human labor and that can be bought and sold on the market. And in order to accumulate capital, you have to buy cheap and sell dear. This means the market value of a commodity should always outweigh its production costs so that the difference would go into your pocket in the form of profit. And since capitalism is a system geared towards, at least theoretically, unlimited capital accumulation, it has an inherent tendency to turn everything into commodities. This is a process that we call commodification. I don't know if you heard about the word. Should I write it on the blackboard or? Okay. That is a process that we call commodification. And by turning things into commodities, I don't only mean tangible or material things, but actually everything. Also immaterial entities like ideas, affections, emotions, everything. And from this capitalistic point of view, human labor itself is also a commodity that can be bought and sold on the market and subject to the economic laws of supply and demand. Precarization is actually a side effect of this tendency to commodify human labor. And precarization means in general an occupational and eventually existential insecurity that is imposed upon human labor. But when we say precarization, we actually mean several things. It entails lack of job and employment security. It entails an erosion of occupational ethics and fraternity, downward mobility, and an overall vulnerability due to the lack of social security cushions and personal savings. These are all results of the naked exposure of labor markets to the capricious fluctuations of demand. The subjugation of everything to the violence of market laws has been achieved by gradually eliminating all the gains of the workers' movements of the last 150 years. This was done primarily on 3 different levels. First of all, on a scientific theoretical level, by producing a set of economy theories that preached the elimination of labor-protecting regulations. Second, on a political level, by applying these theories to actual state policies. And last but not least, it was achieved on a psychosocial level through subliminal business administration strategies to align the worker to the interests of the capital. And with the concomitant rise of immaterial production technologies and this neoliberal assault since the late 1970s, this inherent tendency of capitalism to commodify everything has spread over to skilled, immaterial, intellectual labor force. And since the academic labor force is also a segment within immaterial intellectual labor, its precarization is also a part of this whole story of commodification. And it comes in doubly handy for the power holders in neoliberal times, in the structural and in the political sense. In the structural sense, it leads to a devaluation of the skilled labor force, and it's actually a part of a corporate strategy to reduce costs. And on the political level, this devaluation of skilled labor force leads to political inactivity, leads to labor servility. It increases labor servility. Moreover, the discrediting of science through reactionary populist politics also serves to validate the pervasive irrationality that increasingly comes to dominate the public and political discourse these days. So you see that precarization of the academic labor force is actually not only an issue of the academics themselves, nor am I problematizing it just because it affects me, but also because it has profound social and political implications for the future of human societies. And thank God, Turkey offers an exceptionally rich laboratory for the study of the precarization of academic labor force. In addition to the global mechanisms of the casualization and precarization of academic labor, the academics in Turkey are also faced with constant insecurity on political grounds. The market mechanisms to commodify academic labor are utilized for the purposes of political intimidation. Throughout the last year, we have seen how the university administrations conspired with the state in the oppression of oppositional voices within the universities, and how they put their decisive authority over the job security of the academic into the service of the state. And all of this is buttressed and legitimized by the deeply rooted anti-intellectualism within the Turkish society. So in that sense, we can say that the academics in Turkey are actually faced with a triple pressure mechanism consisting of economic and political precarization and socio-cultural marginalization. The ongoing witch hunt in the Turkish universities is actually a part of a wider, distinctly neoliberal attempt on the part of the states to eradicate rational agency. And it found itself an exceptionally fertile breeding ground in Turkey because of some historical peculiarities of the Turkish society, such as the submissiveness of the universities and the deeply rooted anti-intellectualism. The Academics for Peace petition was initially an attempt to bring back peace to the agenda, but its actual significance lies perhaps rather in the fact that it uncovered this unholy correlation between the local circumstances and the dynamics of neoliberalism. Let's take a look at what happened throughout the last year. Here's what happened. In January 2016, 1,128 academics from different institutions signed an online petition. At the beginning, I thought it was a change.org campaign, really. I didn't know what it was. They signed an online petition to express their discontent with the systematically violent policies of the Turkish state in the Kurdish regions and demanded a restart of the peace negotiations. However, right after the declaration became public, the first terminations and suspensions started, first in the provincial and in private universities. This was not at all a coincidence that the massacre began there, but actually a very well-thought strategy to put the public reaction to a test. And in fact, at the beginning, no one, not even our fellow signatories, paid much attention to it. Because there's a common acceptance that the provincial universities do not occupy a major role in the academic climate anyway, and the private universities are known to fire and hire their academic staff in bunches every semester, no one really cared about it. In fact, if the massacre remained limited to the provincial universities and the low-ranked private universities, everybody would have made their peace with it. That's the tragic part of it. However, things have changed, tables have turned, and with the state of emergency, this huge, massive wave of cleansing spread over to some renowned state universities, and then everybody got alarmed. And now we have 451 academics for peace who got dismissed from the universities, and 371 of them are decreed, which means they are banned from public service altogether. And I belong to those. And the most disturbing part of all of this is that this happened with the passive acceptance of our colleagues and with the active participation of the university administrations. You know, we have rectors who pride about how they voluntarily took initiative to include the names of the peace academics in the decree lists. Recently, there was this pretty disturbing report on BBC Turkey based on interviews with some rectors from renowned state universities. And there, the rector of Ege University said that he cannot give any statement contrary to the decisions of the Council of Higher Education, YÖK. The rector of Marmara University went even a step further and confessed bluntly that it was the rectorate's decision, without any external pressure from the Council of Higher Education whatsoever, to include the peace academics alongside alleged Gülen supporters in the decree lists. And he even said that the signatories in Marmara were actually given the chance to withdraw their signatures, but none of them took it, as if forcing the people to deny their true political convictions were something to brag about. The question is, how could such an abominable degree of rottenness be possible? And, you know, I'm only giving a very small piece of that here. The true depth of the filth is beyond your imagination. How could that be possible? Well, as a sociologist, I see here two mutually reinforcing factors standing out. The first one is rather a global systemic one, stemming from the structural rigidity of the academic labor market, and is related to what Pierre Bourdieu had called the structural violence of fear. We all know that the academic labor market is really tight, and most of the universities are comprised of contingent, sessional, casualized staff, and it's really difficult to find a more or less steady lecturer position. Very few people manage to do it, either by chance or by pulling the right strings. And once you are fired, you quickly fall out of the ranks of this small academic labor aristocracy, and the chances are very high that you may never return. This constant threat of unemployment makes it, in any case, hard to take a rock-solid ethical standing. The sociologist Richard Sennett defined this deforming impact of precarious work on the worker's personality as the corrosion of character. And apparently, the academic labor force is in no way exempt from that. The second factor that played into the erosion of academic ethics in Turkey is rather a specialty of Turkey, generated by the authoritarian state tradition in Turkey. And in that sense, it could be described as a local political-cultural factor. The organic ties of the universities to the state since their foundation has always impeded critical thought to a great extent and molded the majority of the academics into a submissive mass of state officials. This has been particularly true for state universities, but since the private universities of the last decades have been founded by the same cadres from these state universities and as profit-seeking enterprises, no significant opposition could be expected from their ranks either. So here we see how the global dynamics of neoliberalism, the rigidity of the academic labor market, and the submissiveness of the universities to the state in Turkey converge to contrive a highly toxic academic environment. And it becomes clear, and it makes me sad to say that a certain degree of corruptibility is required to sustain an academic career in Turkey. Let's take a look at the historical background of this submissive relationship of the universities to the state. During the nation-building process, the intellectuals' organic ties to the state led them to assume the role of the vanguard of a state-led social engineering program. And this also involved producing pseudo-scientific justifications for the political and cultural violence inherent to this nation-building process. And the universities in Turkey were actually founded as part of this centralist modernization project. And their ranks were carefully filled only with professors who were devoted to this project. In that sense, the history of the universities in Turkey is actually the history of paying lip service to the universal academic values and of trampling down on them. We have actually many instances on this matter, like the Darülfünun reform of 1933, the witch hunt in the Faculty of Languages, History, and Geography at Ankara University in 1947-1948. We have this tension between the Menderes government and the university professors whom he had mocked as the Black Gown. We have the rash expulsion of 147 professors right after the coup in 1960. We have the elimination of the leftist students and professors from the universities right after the coup in 1971. We have the establishment of the Council of Higher Education after the coup in 1980. We have the expulsion of some 70 predominantly leftist professors in 1983 under the martial law of 1402. We have the suspensions during the process of February 28, 1997, 1998. And now, the same line of action is at work against Academics for Peace. Well, on the whole, there has never really been a time that the universities were completely free of the raison d'etat. The interesting part of all of this is that the AKP actually descends from a counter-tradition and is seen as the historical other of the Republican elites. Yet somehow it inherited the same authoritarian state tradition. And now albeit in a different form under an openly anti-intellectualist government, the same restrictive essence of the state's approach toward intellectual production persists. The memory of the long-term conflicts between the Republican elites and the Muslim masses only adds a further vengefulness to the AKP's approach toward intellectuals. The thing is, the Republican elites were at least keen on preserving a Western facade, and it somehow prevented a wholesale obliteration of academic structures. However, today, under an openly anti-intellectualist government, the shine wears off, and this submissive relationship of the universities to the state threatens to evolve into an indiscriminate annihilation of all intellectual activity per se. At this point, we should probably cut the universities some slack, because the ambiguous relationship to authority is actually not only limited to universities in Turkey. It is an inherent character trait of the Turkish society, and it stems from the authoritarian state tradition also. In the face of the mostly arbitrary nature of laws and rules, most people prefer to avoid a direct confrontation with authority and instead search for cracks and holes in the system where they can sneak through. And this kind of collective behavior leads to a general normlessness that permeates more or less every aspect of social relations. Within the academic circles, this tendency to bypass the rules translates into mediocrity in every sense, especially regarding the scientific qualifications of an academic. Someone got mad. You know, finding a shorter way around is seen as a virtue in Turkish society. And the strict adherence to academic standards is mostly seen as making things unnecessarily harder, or in last instance, as a sign of arrogance. However, when it comes to intellectual production, finding a shorter way around often means to compromise certain academic criteria. And the responsibility of the intellectual suffers the same fate. Historically and institutionally speaking, the occupation as an academic is seen and exercised as an educational officialdom in Turkey. It's seen as a job. And despite all the pompous verbosity about being so dedicated to science and research and blah, the average academic in Turkey is rarely anything more than an instructor of precompiled lectures. Under these circumstances, it should not come as a surprise that right after the petition became public, that most of the signatories got indecent proposals from university administrations who encouraged them to confess that they didn't read the declaration thoroughly and advised them to withdraw their signatures to keep our jobs. We understand that in order to survive in Turkish universities, one has either to be so out of his senses as to sign a political declaration without reading it thoroughly, or one has to be such a spineless fraud as to lie and disclaim all responsibility for one's own political actions. And all this for the sake of keeping a job. well, where even being an academic boils down to nothing more than compliant, makes no waves worker doom, the criminalizing attitude of the AKP towards intellectuals and Erdogan's hate-mongering against dissident academics cannot be deemed an isolated phenomenon which can be explained by the dictatorial ambitions of one single man. They are actually the reflection of the heart and soul of an entire society. That was it.